Looks like we have a small group. I think that's actually kind of a good thing because I wanted this to be more of a dialogue. I want to get your input, your feelings about something that I've become kind of passionate about over the last few years. And that's bringing together the disciplines of enterprise architecture and ITFM. Are they natural partners? How do we bridge that gap, and why should we consider bridging that gap? I've got a deck of slides which we'll use, but I don't care if we get through them all or not. If we get a chance to talk and have some discussion, that's even better. The slides are a derivative of a presentation I was putting together for the ITFMA conference, which didn't happen this year. So this is my chance to try this out and get some input and revise it before we get in front of the crowd. So I'm excited about that. So let's see if we can get this thing to cooperate. And there you go. The usual disclaimers. Everything you're going to hear is just my opinion based on my experiences. I appreciate the support of Nan and Thavron allowing me to present this, and I've certainly been appreciative of all the things I've learned at the TBM Council and at the ITFMA conferences. Some definitions of terms. I'm a big believer that definitions are the foundation of any actual communication, particularly around something complicated like this. And this talk about, should ITFM be part of EA, and should EA be involved with ITFM, and is there a value proposition around that? I'm Bryan Drake. I'm currently an enterprise architect for Unisys Corporation. Before that, I was enterprise architect for Northrop Grumman Corporation for some period of time. I've been in and out of enterprise architecture and IT finance off and on over the years. My enterprise architect experience goes back to about the year 1999. And I've always had a passion for counting the numbers as well. And I've really have enjoyed this journey. So I'm probably the only person here who actually came in from the IT side. Is that correct? Or did any of you come in to ITFM from, maybe Carmen, you're probably an IT person, aren't you?
I'm Cammie, I'm an IT person. I'm just now starting to learn about all of this IT stuff.
I came in from the IT side too, so.
That's true, you did, but you have a passion for ITFM now, that's for sure.
Yeah. I actually have a little bit of experience from our business side and transferred to IT many years ago.
I think I have a poll number 3. Can you launch that one, Nan? So I know at least one person has enterprise architects. So does your organization even have an enterprise architecture team? I know Ginger and I do, yes. Results? Oh, so at least one of us doesn't have an enterprise architect team at all. Not too surprising. I'll talk about why I think that is, in my opinion, in a little bit. Okay. PowerPoint and display and don't. There we go. Okay. So a few definitions that I pulled up from 3 different sources: a definition of enterprise architecture and what it is. And all of these contain something in common, and that is they all talk about how EA's job is to align IT architecture and infrastructure with the business goals. And regardless of how you state it, there's an intersection that jumps out plainly at me, even though it's been an interesting journey having the conversation with both the enterprise architecture side about why they should care about ITFM, and some of the ITFM pips as to why they might want to care about interacting with enterprise architecture. Gartner, Tech Target, CIO, these are just 3 I pulled out. That seems to be a common theme. It's all largely ignored by a lot of architects, I might say.
I was going to say, it's interesting that in the world and the definitions, the definition of enterprise architecture is to align with the business goals or the business needs, and yet most of the enterprise architects you talk to say that their goal is to set technical standards for IT.
Yeah. Interesting enough, 20 years ago, I worked for our now client, an organization called Virginia Information Technology Agency, or VITA as we call them, and there is a single sentence in their enterprise architecture documentation about aligning with the business, and that's it. That's as far as they got with even talking about anything to do with the business, which I find kind of amusing. Lots of standards, lots of documentation, 20 years of history there, but really just lip service is what I call it to enterprise architecture. And TBM Council defines what I call this ITFM according to the TBM Council. Cost, quality, and value of IT investments to their business partner and drive innovation for the organization. And those are all things we can and should care about, that's for sure. I think everyone on this call does, or we wouldn't be sitting here, many of us on our own time. There are a number of enterprise architecture frameworks over the years. There have been maybe 15 or more that have kind of come and gone. There are basically 4 that are still around. Most prominent one is TOGAF, the Open Group Architecture Framework. In the federal space, it's FEAF. That's had a couple of different names. Of course, Gartner, obviously, they have their own enterprise architecture framework, as Gartners want to do, and Zachman, which is a little bit different architecture framework. The reason I say that is because these are different frameworks, but they all have some things in common. This is one of the first pictures I ever saw, or diagrams of enterprise architecture. Actually, it was the lead slide on the web page that I built for the EA team back 20 years ago. And sometimes this is called a fat bottom approach. When I look at that, it says everything should be driven from the business. But most architects look at that and say everything depends on technology architecture as the foundational element. I don't know about you, but I find that kind of backwards, if you excuse the expression. Ginger, do you find that your enterprise architects are integrated in and aligned with the business, or are they kind of out on their own island most of the time?
I think they're on their own island, and I'm not even sure how in touch with the business's reality they are.
Your experience is not uncommon.
I mean, if they really were aligning us with the business, they would be more business facing. Mm-hmm. And I would guarantee you none of our business partners could even name one of our EAs.
And I would question, how can you talk to the business if you can't talk dollars and cents? If you can't put things in financial terms, your voice to the business is going to stop at a certain layer of the ladder, because in my experience, when you get high enough up in a business, if you're not talking dollars and cents, they're not listening.
Right.
But this is one of the most common views. Everything builds on top of it. But the reality is the little tiny piece at the top, in my opinion, should be the most important piece. But most architects think that bottom layer is where they live. And I'll talk about Gartner hype cycle in a minute. This is TOGAF I mentioned. Again, the Open Group Architecture Framework, if you look, starts with an architecture vision, and the very first thing you're supposed to do is develop a business architecture before you do anything else. And other than maybe putting a bit of lip service in a document, most architecture teams tend to skip over that in my experience. It's a fairly elaborate cycle of architecture process that is widely used. I won't go into the details of it. It'll probably bore you to tears. The whole point I'm trying to make here is that, there is an intersection, whether people want to admit it or not. And I'm sure we've all seen these hype cycles from Gartner over the years. Who hasn't? They have this little thing, and you would kind of think, looking at this, like maybe you could put years at the bottom, like, it's 1977 and 1990. But in my experience, this hype cycle tends to repeat itself. There's a whole lot of attention to architecture. We hire a lot of enterprise architects. We generate a ton of documentation of various quality. We get obsessed with the documentation, in fact. And then as time goes on, people start saying, why are we spending all this money? Where's the value in enterprise architecture? And you go from, for instance, when I started with Northrop Grumman, when they came in and took the state contract in about 2006, they stood up a big enterprise architecture discipline, hired a bunch of architects, sent them off to training, generated tons and tons and tons of documentation, most of which never got read again. And then there came a financial crisis in the state when the economy went back down and they were overspent. And they were looking for places to cut, and that's one of the places they cut. They stripped them down to the bone. And then later we kind of reached a better place where we had a staff of enterprise architects doing architecture, but it wasn't that massive expectation. So I believe I have a poll around this, don't I? I can't see my polls from where I sit. Yeah. Where do you think your company is on that cycle? Just curious. And interesting enough, this is a new program I'm working on, and there's a what we call managed service multi-source integrator approach at MSI, and they have a massive architecture effort, and they have developed massive documents, which they slavishly require you to fill out. So I'm going to put, if you can see my screen, I think we're still in inflated expectations in this current cycle.
Yeah. That's when you see them start to go, oh, so many documents, that's always a bad sign.
We've literally spent tens of thousands of dollars per document on these things because of all the meetings and reviews and revisions and process that they built around it. Some of it, I did an architecture document for the private cloud, and conservatively, we spent $40,000 worth of labor on it. And the ones that we did for the new data center took months and months and months and months. So well, pretty well split up at getting started, inflated, and trough of disillusionment. Yeah, I think we're in inflated expectation. I think this is something that just kind of happens over and over, but that doesn't mean there isn't value in architecture by any stretch of the imagination. Bless you. All right. There you go. So there's a big difference between theory and practice. What I have observed in practice is most architects want to focus on the technology. That's it. They do what I call bottom up instead of top down. The business is not, given a cursory wave of the hand in the documentation, but everything's driven by technology. Their objective, best technology solution, nothing about value. Is this similar to what you all have seen, those of you who have enterprise architects on board? When I came into this role back with Northrop Grumman, I observed real quickly that the technology side of the house always wants the best technology solution, and the finance side of the house always wants the lowest cost solution, and neither of those is the right answer, in my opinion. It shouldn't be the cheapest one, and it shouldn't be the fanciest one. It should be the one that represents the best value for the money spent. I'm pretty sure no one on this call would disagree with me. Any comments on that?
Hi, Brian. This is Carmen.
Hi, Carmen.
If I know our enterprise architecture from our point of view, it looks like it's comparing our software footprints. In other words, to look for duplicate applications that are doing the same thing and connecting them to the business units. Does that go into the bottom up or the top down?
Well, that's a point case use of enterprise architecture. It's not a bad one, it's an important one. At least they're thinking about getting rid of some duplicate technology. But again, are we just looking at duplicates? Or are we looking at what are we spending on these applications compared to what the value is? I don't care if it's the best solution in the world. If only 10 people
Yeah.
use it, it costs me $1 million a year, I got to question it.
Right, right.
But if it costs you $1 million a year and 10 people use it, but it generates $2 billion in revenue, then
Exactly.
go for it, right? But
Yeah.
if it is just somebody's little quirk and they prefer that program over the one that's standard that the other 98 people are using who have the same job, then you have questions about it.
Right. As I said, business architecture I find is largely ignored. And architects aren't included in the financial discussions. There's this kind of wall between them. So while we can sit on the financial side of the wall and throw stones at the architects for not thinking about cost and value, they can throw rocks back and say, well, you don't include us in any of those discussions, which is generally true. Ginger, you have enterprise architects, and apparently Karma does. Are they included in the financial discussions?
We try. Quite honestly, I don't think they see that as part of their role. And so that's part of why I'm reaching out and trying to actively form that relationship with them and help them see how, how we connect, and then how we can give them dollars to go along with decisions and review of options, in hopes of trying to help them care more about the numbers. If it's not their personal cost in their budget, they don't seem to see that as their problem to solve.
Yeah. Well, that's a good start that you headed that way. I know when I started, I'd first convinced my boss that it was okay for me to do ITFM. I was the chief architect on the program, said, I want you to be cranking out documentation like everybody else. And when I started laying the definitions on the table and talking about them, he said, well, yeah, we've been overlooking it, but it's right there in every one of these frameworks, including the one I train my people on, that we're supposed to be aligning with the business objectives. And you can't, I would argue that you can't be aligned with business objectives if you don't understand cost or value, more importantly.
Right.
So you're seeing what I've seen, typically little to no interaction between the EA and the ITFM, and I think that's a real missed opportunity personally. We'll talk a little bit why I think that's the case. And of course, the business asks, why is IT so expensive? I'd like to talk about this last one because I think we're all passionate about this. The difference between cost optimization and value optimization. Cami, what's your take on that? How do we differentiate between cost optimization and value optimization?
Well, I would say, yeah, I'm not really sure. I know that in my particular company, a lot of times I have to make people step back and look at if they're going to get any value out of what they want, or is there going to be a return on investment? Because I know, like, with the architects, they always want the newest technology, the coolest toys, or, like, we have a software solution in place, but, oh, this new student intern uses this software, so let's get that too. And then now we need 20 copies of that software that does the same thing as the one we currently have in place. So I know a hard part of my job is getting them to realize that we can't have everything we see. We have to, like, are we going to get enough value to spend that cost or spend that money to purchase that item? And the other thing is, because we're working for other clients, also getting them to, like, bill that cost to the clients, because they want all these new technologies to win the jobs to show to the clients, but they don't want to charge the clients for that cool toy. So I would say I don't think I'm really answering your question, but that's one of my bigger challenges.
That's a good set of observations, Cami. That's a good set.
Because you can get the cheapest thing, but it might not actually solve your problem.
That's part of it. You're right. Because I call it the shiny object syndrome. Ooh, I want this shiny object. Even if it costs a bunch of money, Or they think, well, it's only $50 times 100 people
Ooh,
per
I
year.
wish that was the case. It's more like it's only $3,000. But yeah, I have a lot of that, and sometimes it's like, well, we already have something built into our normal costs that could solve this so-called problem you're having. So let's just use this other thing we have in place.
Yeah.
Brian, one thing I've started doing is I'm like, yeah, that sounds super cool. So let's walk through how you would sell that to the CFO to ask for money, because that's what I'm going to have to do. And after they get through stammering around a minute, they're like, never mind.
Yeah, sometimes, sorry, I do find that to be the case. Like when you tell them, okay, that costs more than a certain amount, so now you're going to have to go to the CEO and justify this cost, then suddenly they don't need it as much or want as many.
Or if you can lay it out for them and go, oh, that's great. You realize that price tag is the equivalent of 7 FTE on your team. So can you pick the 7 that go away? And they're like, oh no.
Unfortunately, I have to use that analogy at work more than I'd like to, you know. And sometimes, in our case, it's right now, it's not just about spending money. Since we're paid, our revenue is driven directly by our CMDB accuracy. I keep finding process problems. I found one last month, and they weren't updating the CMDB when virtual servers were turned over in production. And, oh, well, we can fix that. I said, but you realize this has been going on for months and it's over $70,000 a month in lost revenue. How many jobs is that equal to, folks? This is important stuff. You got to close the loop, not just deliver it. And you want to take a crack at offering your expert opinion? Because I know you know the answer to this one. It's a big issue for us.
Cost optimization versus value optimization.
Yeah.
Value optimization, you really want to right size what IT investment needs to be, whether it's CapEx or OpEx, in order to provide the most value to the business that meets their goals, right? So it's not about whether IT wants to do something, it's about whether IT can enable or empower the business to do something, and so that's where you find your value.
Exactly, yeah. And that's a novel concept to a lot of people, particularly people in IT. It's also kind of a novel concept to some people in finance, because finance typically just looks at the lowest price tag, and it may or may not be the best value. Like your point you made earlier, you know, oh, this thing costs, you know, $100,000 a year, but it's generating $1 million in revenue. Maybe it is a good thing. You have to look at all those things.
What we are excited about, and I think you've heard several stories today, is proving out that when IT can have the value conversation, finance responds to that. And they don't push for the lowest numbers. In fact, they're willing to give you more money if you're actually proving the bottom line value, because that's actually what they're looking at, right? And if they think the best way to get bottom line value is to reduce your costs, that's what they're going to try and do. But if you have a counterexample to them and can show why giving IT more money actually increases business value, then they're going to do that, right? That's their goal.
So I guess what I'm advocating here is to work this issue from both ends. That is, have the value conversations with the finance side of the house, but get the enterprise architects involved and get them to understand the concept of value too, and understand that when you come to the table with a shiny object, you need to have a value proposition that you can defend, not just it's the latest, greatest thing. Well, some of you have seen my slide on cost optimization. In my opinion, cost optimization is a huge trap. And apparently it's one of the main reasons why ITFM projects last about 24 to 36 months max, because they're so busy cost optimizing, they forget that you can't keep doing that over and over. And then when there's no more dollars being saved, why am I spending all this money? And why have I hired all these people? It's a huge, huge trap in my opinion, because If you save your company 15% the first year of your program, what's the business going to say? Your CFO is going to say, "I told you IT was spending too much money." And then he's going to do what?
Cut your budget.
15%. I'm going to cut your budget by 15% next year so you can do it again. That's what happens. Because if you're reducing your IT budget year over year in this day and age, when we're in a digital economy, you're inhibiting your company's ability to compete. So that's a really bad thing. Doesn't mean cost optimization is on the surface is something I disagree with, obviously. I do it all the time. But that shouldn't be the goal. It should be value optimization by, okay, I'm going to take the $1 million I saved over here, and I'm going to enable this capability that we didn't have the money to do before that will bring in revenue, improve sales, do whatever is your company's business. Any agreement, disagreement with that?
Agree.
So why? Why should we partner with enterprise architecture? Some of you I know have attended my presentation on IT cross predictability modeling and may remember the top 3 success factors that I outlined in that presentation. Nan probably remembers them. Number 1, relationships. Number 2, want to take a guess? Relationships. Number 3,
More relationships.
you got it.
Relationships.
Like, location, location, location. Really building those relationships is a key factor to any of these things we're doing, because it's in the role we play in our organization. Our role is to bring people together, to translate back and forth between the disciplines, to be the middleman. And in order to do that, you got to focus on, I'll admit it was kind of a big shift for me personally, because I've always been I was wanting to excel in my own space and be the master contributor, highest contributor in everything, that mentality. But I had to rethink and say, I can get more. What I can accomplish is a lot more than what I can do. And the way I accomplish more than I could possibly do is with relationships. So who do you want relationships with? I think that's probably the most obvious one. Everybody realizes you have to build a relationship with the people who have authority. And we've heard several examples today where relationships with the CFO or the CIO have enabled you to get funding or get approval for projects and move forward and achieve what you choose. But there are 2 other categories of people that we don't want to forget. Second one are people with influence. There may only be 1 or 2 people in your organization who actually have authority. But typically a person who has authority, especially if they have authority of a big budget, there's a circle of people who have tremendous influence. None of those people can say yes, but they can get your boss to say no, in my experience. So figure out who are the influencers. And the other people you want to really have a good relationship with, in my experience, is people who have the information you need, because everything we do is driven by information. I mean, we spend millions of dollars on software to organize all this information, but if you don't, and how many times have I heard, what we call it data in IT? How many times just today have I heard, biggest challenge was lack of data or unreliable data. That's one of the big mountains we have to climb up. So figure out who are the people in the organization that have information that will enable you to succeed. So back to the EA. An enterprise architect may or may not have authority. If you have a chief architect, he may have some authority, but more likely the architects are people who have influence. And they're the people who see the big picture. A good enterprise architect also is generally good at doing presentations or at least writing documentation. If you can get them to understand that they need to explain the value proposition for their business and technology decisions, an EA can really help you translate and communicate with business, finance, and IT. I don't know about you, but I grew up on the writings of Rudyard Kipling, who I thought kind of blended poetry and prose and storytelling in an elegant way. So this is one of my favorite quotes from one of the Rudyard Kipling stories. If you remember, it's about how the elephant got his nose. Anybody grew up reading those stories besides me? So vantage number one, architects have influence and they have information. They're the people building the standards for your future technology. And knowing what they're up to is important to you if you want to succeed, or important to us. They can tell you what's in the pipeline. And all too often, I find that even well-run organizations, the architecture pipeline isn't really exposed to the finance or business side of the house until they've already made a commitment to what they're going to do. Enterprise architecture may not be embedded in the business as we define it, but they are hopefully embedded with the technology side of the business. So they can have influence and they can have a lot of information. It's a good thing to build that relationship you're working on, Ginger. I think that'll pay off in the long run.
Yeah, I'm kind of pleased that my boss recently, so we have like an architectural review board and then a leadership technology advisory group. So the ARB will come up with recommendations and then they take it to the LTAG group for approval. And in the past, I would find out it happened like when this big unplanned purchase came through and I'm like, what the heck is this? Now my boss has finally come around to telling people you can't even get on the agenda to bring something to LTAG unless Ginger signed off on the financials. So to me, that's a huge shift for the good.
A very good shift. Kudos to you for achieving that level of trust.
Well, it took 4 years, but better late than never, I say.
Well, it took me a while with my former employer too, but it kind of reached that point where the director of finance, someone walked in her office with a request to spend money, and she said, "What did Bryan say about it? Has it been through the review board?" Because we had a technology spend review board that we set up that reviewed all the planned and upcoming spends and aligned them with the budget. So, and I've kind of, amazingly enough, I've only been with this company about a year and a half, a little less than 2 years now, and already the client executive, who is the only person who can, on the program, who can authorize spending money, won't approve anything without me going over it with him. Didn't take but a few examples when he, particularly when he got stuck for it, several $100,000 last year because he failed to ask. And then afterwards, I had the job of pointing out to him that was an expenditure we didn't need to make.
Yeah.
So what's the other side of the coin? Advantage number two. By getting embedded in the enterprise architecture team and training them and helping them understand value conversations, you can actually change the way solutions are architected. Help them, I said learn. I'll just first run through. Learn about total cost and all the connected costs, because the obvious cost is often not the real cost of things. EAs, being techie people, tend to think the cost of hardware and software is the only thing that matters, but they don't think about the cost of support or the cost of people or the disruption cost to the business for what they're doing. I think that the flip side of that is what they can do for you is you can help them learn to think about value, talk about value, and expand their vision so they understand TCO, not just the standard one that I always cringe when I say TCO, because over the years, I think vendors have proven that given enough assumptions, you can make a TCO argument for anything they want to sell you. At least on PowerPoint. That's one of the reasons I think it's important that we try to embed that discipline in our organization to go back and revisit projects and see, did we deliver value or not, and did we estimate the cost correctly? And I can tell you, I took 3+ years in G to mature that vision to reality, and it's going to take a while here, but there's a tendency to put numbers into a machine. I call it a machine. We have this pricing engine, and we put all these assumptions in, and it spits out a number, and we put it on a piece of paper and hand it to our customer and say, that's what I'm going to charge you. And I think I've also said, well, but this is a very sophisticated pricing engine. I said, well, looking at the financials on my program, it's not working.
Yeah.
We've got RUs, we've got resource units that are underwater by 2 to 1. And one of them is the fastest growing resource unit, which is a really bad combination to have. It's growing like crazy, but the more we do, the less we make, the more we lose. So we need to go back and validate after the fact and say, okay, we bid this contract with these assumptions. Did it come to fruition? And that I was enjoying that kind of kept popping up a couple of times today around, do you go back and look at it? And most people don't. I don't think they even want to be aware of it. But I think these are kind of in my opinion, the key reasons for my argument that EA and ITFM must be joined as a team. I don't mean physically as a team, but we've got to get a way to bridge that gap and get your voice in the enterprise architecture process early on, so they start thinking about the value conversations, and they understand that, and they understand that also the importance of planning, which they typically don't. One thing I did in G was with the Director of Finance's approval was we put a process in place, and you had, in order to get this Director of Finance to sign off on something, this form had to be filled out. And one of the questions is, where is it in the budget, and how much did you budget, and how much is the actual? And they learned after a while, if you come to the finance side of the house, or you go to see Bryan, when you start going down the path, not when you get to the other end, and you get planned funding in the budget, you can get your project approved. But if you come to the table with an unexpected expense, don't give me that it's a crisis stuff, because I lived through that. We had a director of technology for a while in the program who was a master at crisis management. By that I mean he created crisis so he didn't ever have to justify what he was doing. He would show up at the gate with a crisis in hand that we had to spend $3 million this month on. And he didn't see anything wrong with that strategy because it seemed to work for him. But we all know what havoc that creates on the financial side, which is part of our job is to tamp down the havoc and put planning around what we're doing, I would say. So I can't look y'all in the face. I like talking to people one-on-one, but this is fun. And these should be familiar to all of us, but they're not to EA. They need to learn about the value conversations. Cost per performance, is it aligned with the business? Are we investing in innovation? Or are we just spending money? And agility. These are not things that most enterprise architects have been trained to think about. But I'm sure everyone on this call agrees with me that these are the first things we should learn to think about. So give them a chance to learn, bring them in. I think I'd be really interested, Ginger, to follow up as you go through and see how successful you are, because I think you have a great opportunity there for yet another big win for you. And of course, the value outcomes. Are we delivering value for the money? Are we shaping business demand? And are we changing the perception role of IT? Because most companies, even the state, it's the same old thing. IT costs too much. IT costs too much. And we have to constantly be working to change that conversation. And if we can partner with enterprise architecture in that conversation, I think we have a much better chance of getting there. So my recommendations are all of us is educate your enterprise architects in TBM and ITFM. Engage them in the financial reviews. Maybe, well, it used to be ITFM week. Give them the TBM book to read. Maybe get them a certification. That was one of the things I did. I went and got my certification, CTMD. And make that value compensation part of all the technology design reviews. Because right now, most design reviews on the program I'm on right now with enterprise architecture, the word value never even occurs. It's all about, did you fill out all the check boxes in this monster form we created? Not are you delivering value? What's the value proposition for what you're bringing to the table? And that, to me, is the most important part of the discussion. And I think if we partner with them, they can help us explain to the business the value of IT investments. If someone who's been in EA for a while, hopefully is a good technical writer and hopefully a good communicator, not all, but most of them are. In order to survive in that space, you kind of sort of have to. And those are the kind of people we need on our side. So I got a bunch of other slides I'm not going to even go to. I put the questions here because I really just wanted to have a conversation with you about it. So after this conversation, are you more convinced or less convinced that enterprise architecture and ITFM need to work together?
My conviction.
How about you, Carmen? Did you? Are you the one that said you did or didn't? I think one of you said you didn't even have an EA.
I think I'm more convinced that it needs to go together because of the background conversations that are going on will justify the expense, will justify the cost analysis behind the actual work that's being done and improve the IT value that's so important.
Good.
Bryan, here's an interesting question. So a couple of the conversations we've had today have shown that it is possible to make really good success in value conversations even without executive sponsorship, right? Your CIO might not be 100% on board as long as they're not working against you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's easier when you have executive sponsorship. Do you think it's possible for this to be a grassroots activity, or does it need to be blessed by the CIO and have other executives looking at it and discussing it?
You want my opinion or you want the group's opinion?
Well, I want yours first, and then we can open it up to the group.
Obviously, and I say that somewhat facetiously, anything you can get executive buy-in is a plus.
Sure.
But it can also be a minus because if everybody feels like everything's being shoved down the pipe on them, they get resistant. But if you can build that groundswell of more people using the same words and meanings about the same things like value compensation and cost per performance and value for the money spent, it becomes part of your corporate language, if your business's language set, and you got a better chance of getting it approved by the top. That's just my opinion. I think you kind of work it from both sides. A lot of people jump straight to that first category of relationships. I've got the person with authority is here, and therefore I'm going to get what I need done. And that's important, but that may not be the place to start.
Mm-hmm.
Does that go back to the thinking of authority versus influence?
Mm-hmm. And there's always the possibility if you bank on that authority and that role changes, because most C-suite people don't stay for a long time anymore. If you've got one champion, and you're, in my experience, if you have one champion and you're marching uphill against the landslide, and that champion goes away, you're going to get swept down the hill. You're done.
I completely agree. So as an architect, for the finance people in the room, what is the best value prop that they could go back and propose to their enterprise architects so they're not feeling like you just want me to do more work? I already have too much work to do. I can't keep up with all of the documentation. Now you want me to do more stuff. How do they broach this with the enterprise architect so that the enterprise architect gets excited about it?
Well, I think the most important approach, just, and it's just Brian's opinion, I'm open to other ideas for sure, is that we need to present ourselves not as the Department of No, but as the enablers of change and the enablers of success. And if we can partner with the people doing the architectures, they have a better chance of getting their wonderful architecture approved and funded and in production. As opposed to the old way, which is they go off on the side and they look at all the bright, shiny objects and they choose the shiniest one and with the most glitter, and they put a proposal together and come to the gate of the finance team and say, step it up. I had an architect actually tell me one time, said, we're just going to do the right thing and finance will just have to catch up. And
Wow.
I looked at him and thought, beg to differ. That's not how we should be going about it. You need architecture needs to bring finance along for the ride, and finance needs to be engaged in the discussion and get what the right thing to do can be a matter of opinion. But if it's something that's not financially viable, I don't care how right it is from a technology standpoint. It's not the right thing to do for your company.
One thing I've tried to do, and you know, I think this is helping us to at least get our conversation started, is I just went to him and said, you know, here's what we're working on. Is there anything that I'm producing that can help you? Because let's face it, every one of us as humans, we're always going to be supportive of what makes our life easier. So I'm trying to find, just give me one thing that I have that you want, and then I can make you want more. And then I can show you how, if your involvement, I can help you even more. Help me help you, kind of thing.
And having attended several of your presentations and had conversations as well with you, Ginger, you successfully play that card quite well, I've noticed, apparently. It's a good one to play. The very first ITFM conference I went to a presentation that kind of blew my mind, and about the internal service economy. And so I went home and said, I'm going to develop my own service catalog of all the things, services I offer, and who are my customers, and what's the service, and what's the value thereof. And so then I would kind of go market, if you will, my services to the people who could use them by saying, I'm not here to say no, I'm here to help you. Here's a service I provide. And I can tell you, it kind of fundamentally changed my approach to how I work with other people when I looked at myself as, what's the gentleman's name whose name I'm going blank on now, who usually at the ITFM conference, who talks about business and outside of business and the internal economy?
Dean.
Yes. I like him because I often disagree with him, but he usually makes me think about things differently, and I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I could restructure how I approach things around, okay, I have a service catalog, I have services like you do, Ginger. I'm doing this and this and this. What on this list could benefit you?
It's been my experience that many, if not most, enterprise architects are modeling geeks.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can go to them and say, hey, I have a model of the dependencies inside of IT, they get very excited, right?
Yeah.
Because they may have built their own, but it's not data-driven, and it's likely something that they've struggled with just as much as you have to build it. And if you're like, hey, I also, and it doesn't have to be a system, right? You don't have to have been something that you spent $250,000 on. It might just be a model that you build in Excel. Remember that most calculating Excel sheets are a type of model. Mm-hmm. And so then if you can go, we can do what-if modeling. If you're thinking about making changes or adapting new frameworks or new technologies, we have the ability to do what-if modeling based off of our base model, and that will not just show you how the dependencies are impacted, but also show you how the cost and value of IT could be impacted.
Exactly.
Almost always that will get somebody in EA really excited. It might not get them all excited, but it'll almost always get your foot in the door.
Yeah, that's a good observation, because I think you're right. Not all, but some enterprise architects are modelers and understand models and are intrigued by them. Some of them are just, frankly, I'm thinking of a couple of people in particular at the moment, they're documenters and box checkers. But a real qualified EA is all about modeling. And so that's a good point. There's an intersection in your interest and expertise that we should be playing out.
That goes back to building the relationships and speaking their language, huh? You agree with that?
Mm-hmm. And it wouldn't hurt for the people on the financial side to, everything's on Google these days. You don't have to buy a book to learn about enterprise architecture, at least at the level able to speak the language or respond to the architect when they use terminology. Learning to...
Another way to engage them is just say, hey, I heard somebody talking about this the other day, and would you be willing to help explain this to me? And then once because a lot of them also enjoy sharing their knowledge, and if you can get them talking, then it gives you that opportunity to ask those innocent questions, and then they really end up answering their own why should they care in that conversation.
So you draw them into a conversation to come up with their own conclusion and answer your questions at the same time?
Yeah. Little sneaky, but it works.
Remember, it's never a bad idea. It's
Wonderful
never
strategy.
you know the answer to.
Well, and I've never been ashamed to say, look, I'm a finance chick. This whole technical stuff is new to me, but here's what I think I understand. Help me. What am I missing?
Yeah, that's a good approach. I think those are the reasons why you've been so successful, Ginger, is because of your approach. Because whether or not you wrote a relationship on the board like I did, your life is working relationships. And that's what is the key to success. Not just for me, but I've observed other people who can work the relationships correctly tend to have the best results.
Well, anybody who thinks they can really succeed in any of this as an island, you better wake up, because it's not possible. And,
Exactly.
Bryan, you said something I really like. I forget if it was you or the gentleman before. But the comment was, I can accomplish more than I can do.
That was me. What I can accomplish is a lot more than I can do on my own.
And that kind of resonated with me, because I've always been like, just get out of my way. I can do it better, cheaper, faster than you. But this has been a humbling experience to realize I might be good at getting people in the right room, the right people in the room to have a conversation and kind of lead the conversation to get what I need. But I don't know what they know, nor do I ever want to know everything they know, and vice versa. But you learn a different way of creating that respect and showing them and me how we're so much better when we're a partner.
When I reached the point in my career where I stopped trying to know everything and do everything, then I started to make progress. I like to say the three hardest lessons I had to learn was, first of all, I don't know it all. And for me, being a brash young man, that was a very hard lesson. And the second and harder but more important lesson is I never will. And the third and vitally important one is that's okay. Mm-hmm. You don't need to know everything. You don't need to have everything. You don't need to be able to do everything. Because like you, I had, for many years, my approach was get out of my way, I'll go do it myself. Because it's easier than trying to explain it to you. But yeah. That's really a career limiting approach. Because if all you can ever accomplish is what you can do on your own, you will always be very limited. But what you can accomplish is what can be done by teams of people working together, the sky's the limit. But I think we're about out of time, but I sure have enjoyed this time, but I sure have enjoyed this, this conversation with all of you.